Well, thank you very much, David, for the invitation. It's always great to see you and Martin, Christina. This position that I have as a senior fellow of the Lehman Center is something I'm very proud of. This is my third talk at the Lehman Center dealing with the evaluation of graduate education in Brazil. It's something that I've specialized in for a long time. And each of these talks are kind of complementary. My first talk was in 2016. And in 2016, I talked about the need to make changes in the copies evaluation system and the system for evaluating graduate programs. I was on a commission at that particular time that was looking into possibilities of innovation and change with respect to the evaluation. And so I gave my talk about the ideas that could be implemented to improve the evaluation. In 2020, I gave a second talk talking about the changes that had been made. As of 2018, many of the changes that were being discussed before that were put into effect. And so in 2020, I talked about the changes that had actually been implemented. And I had a very positive appraisal of these changes because I had participated in the process of formulating and designing these alterations. In addition to be the coordinator for the area of education, I'm a member of the Senior Scientific Council of Copies, and this council, as we'll be mentioning, has the purpose of developing the policies with respect to the evaluation of higher education, or excuse me, with the evaluation of graduate education. So now I'm back again in 2022 with a whole different perspective, but it relates to what I've talked about before. Because now we're talking about what we're referring to as the judicialization of the evaluation process. And the judicialization can be traced back to the changes that I talked about in my past two presentations. So in a sense, while I was very positive a couple of years ago, and I'm still very positive about these changes have generated repercussions that have been unexpected. And that is the topic that I'll be addressing with you today. As I mentioned to you, I'm the coordinator for the area of education. I'm a member of this scientific board at Copies. And Copies appears here on the first slide. But I'm not speaking in the name of Copies. I'm speaking in the name of somebody who specializes in the evaluation of higher education in general, and more specifically graduate education. And I will not be revealing, for example, inside information as to what's going on inside of Copies that's not already divulged. And everything, in other words, everything I'll be talking about is information that's already available, but I'll be putting my particular slant on this information. Now we're to the second slide, and I provide a couple of basic, I think we have some feedback. I don't know if there are some microphones turned on. I'm getting some feedback here. We're talking about two concepts in my title. One is the notion of judicialization, which obviously is the spread of judicial decision-making outside of the judicial province. In other words, it's when judges are making decisions that are normally made by people outside of the judicial system. And we're speaking specifically now about decisions made in the executive branch of the Brazilian government related to education, and the fact that judges are pronouncing or making decisions about those decisions that are made by the executive branch. The second aspect that's emphasized in my title is the question of evaluation of graduate education. And I've already mentioned the word copies a couple of times. I should mention that when I mention copies, I'm talking about an agency that has existed for more than 70 years. It's a foundation that is directly linked to the Ministry of Education. And it was created for the improvement of higher education personnel. The name of Copies in Portuguese refers to the improvement of higher education personnel. And originally, when Copies was created in 1951, the improvement of higher education personnel was interpreted as graduate study, but graduate study that could not be conducted within Brazil because graduate programs did not exist at that time. You had opportunities to study on the graduate level, but you didn't have graduate programs as we know them in terms of master's degrees and doctoral degrees. So what happens? The organization invests heavily in scholarships to study abroad. But over time, in the 1960s especially, you have the legalization of graduate education as an official level of education within Brazil. You have the notion of the program of graduate education being defined, and the program of graduate education was really based on the US framework of graduate education as opposed to, say, the European framework. Because whereas the European framework is based on a tutorial model where a student works with a given professor, in the United States, we have programs. We have students working with given professors, but we're working within a program context, and we're working with many other professors, and we're working in an effort to go through a series of program hurdles in order to get your master's or your doctoral degree. And so this is what happens in Brazil. We have the creation of graduate programs based on the US model that offer master's and or doctoral degrees. And during this time, at the end of the period of the 1960s, you have a legal requirement for university professors, those who work at federal universities at least, and at the time, most of the universities were federal universities. All of a sudden, a legal requirement is put forth whereby professors at the universities have to have graduate degrees, which had not been required before. So all of a sudden, you have a tremendous pressure from within the universities, from people that are working in the universities, to create graduate programs so they themselves can get the necessary credentials. And obviously, other people wanting to go into the university or the academic world from that point on had to go to graduate school, getting a master's and or doctoral degree if they wanted to devote themselves to an academic profession. Please go on to the next slide. So I've talked a little bit about copies in terms of its origin and the idea of giving out scholarships. First of all, the scholarships, as I said, were given out for international study, but as of the 1960s, with the creation and the expansion of programs, graduate programs within Brazil, you have copies changing its focus to the provision of scholarships and other funding to graduate programs within Brazil. We have a rapid expansion of graduate education based on this law requiring professors to have a graduate degree. And with this rapid expansion, we have a problem with the quality of graduate programs. So in 1975, Brazil creates a national plan for graduate education, emphasizing a process of improvement and expansion of graduate education. And in 1976, you have copies, which had focused before that basically on distributing money. All of a sudden, copies was given the responsibility to evaluate graduate programs because of this problem of quality that had become quite obvious by that time. Copies move slowly in terms of creating an evaluation structure because it was new for them. They originally made visits based on committees and commissions, but they decided that they needed a more systematic national evaluation process that took in all the programs in the country and a comparative evaluation that was based on the assumption that there's a single system of graduate education in Brazil, whereas there are many systems for lower levels of education, municipal systems, state systems. We have two systems for higher education, referred to as the federal system and the state system, and all private institutions are part of the federal system, which is why they are subjected to federal regulation and evaluation. But on the graduate level, we only have one system, the national system of graduate education. And as I said, there's a national plan that's reinstated at periodic periods, and you have the evaluation of all the elements of that system. Why was this evaluation created other than a worry about or a concern about quality? Well, it was created because Copies was also having trouble distributing their scholarships, because until that time, people requested scholarships directly. Their request went directly to Copies, and Copies had to evaluate all these requests, and it was beyond their capability because the number of requests was increasing constantly with the increase of the number of programs. And so Copies decides, well, let's give each program a quota, and the program will distribute a certain number of scholarships. But the question then is, how are you going to decide the size of the quota? Which programs are going to get more scholarships and which programs are going to get fewer scholarships? Well, the logic was, let's base this on the quality of the program. Let's give more scholarships. And along with the scholarship comes other funding that goes directly to the program. Let's give more funding to the better programs, because we know that the better programs are going to be more effectively utilizing these resources. And also, it's been going to create an incentive for programs to improve, because more resources are associated with a higher quality program. So a system's created, a national system that's based on the following principles. Annual reports that are sent to copies every year by every program. You have a evaluation period, which began being a 2-year program, a period. It was later a 3-year period. Now it's a 4-year period. You have a period of evaluation. And at the end of that period, committees of academic peers are created to evaluate the programs based on the reports that have been sent in. And there's a committee for each knowledge area. Currently, there are 49 knowledge areas in copies. Each area has a coordinator, and it's the coordinator that creates the committees that are necessary to do the evaluation work. And it's important to emphasize that all of this evaluation is done by peers. It's done by members of the academic community. By 1998, though, copies realized that a change was necessary, because the scale was created for decision-making purposes, for the distribution of funds. And it also served to incentivize improvement on the part of programs. It also served to help students make choices as to where they wish to study. And obviously it had to do with the prestige of the program, including within the international context. So the problem was that by 1997, virtually all the programs were at the top of the scale. In other words, the evaluation was not very rigorous in terms of providing a differentiation between quality. And so the scale was not functioning. It was not doing what it was supposed to be doing. So the decision in 1998 was to expand the scale from 5 levels to 7 levels, to make the top levels very exclusive for just the very, very, very best, and to create this scientific council, which I mentioned that I'm a member of, which has responsibility for approving the final grade that each program receives. And it has responsibility for maintaining the integrity and the comparability of the scale. In other words, are the results comparable across different areas of knowledge? And is the scale distinguishing between levels of quality? In 2018, as I mentioned, we have a number of new changes put forth, not major changes, not changes in the model. The model remains the same, but adjustments that I'll briefly review in just a minute. Please go on to the next slide. I'm going through all of this information about the quality, about the copy system and the nature of the system, because this has to do with the judicialization. You can only understand the reasons for the judicialization if you understand the nature of the copies evaluation, because the judicialization is based on an attack, a legal attack on what copies is doing and has been doing for the past 42 years, ever since 1980. So what are some of the characteristics, briefly reviewing? And some of these I've already mentioned. I like to say that it's a large scale evaluation. This is important because when it started off, it was a small scale evaluation. There are about 400 programs. Now there are nearly 5,000 programs. So this creates stresses on a system that was really created to be a small scale process, and it becomes a large scale process. When I originally became involved in the 1990s, just to give you an example, evaluating programs in the year of education, we had 30-some programs, and we had a committee of 7 people evaluating these 30-some programs. Today, that same committee has 60 people, and they're evaluating almost 200 programs. And so whereas we could work together and create sort of a common perspective when we had 7, to work together and create an organic unified perspective, when you're evaluating over nearly 200 programs using more than 60 people, it becomes much more complicated. A second characteristic, of course, is the fact that it is a standardized evaluation in the sense that it's based on the notion of a single system, that quality is something that must be attained by all programs within that system, that a minimum level of quality exists for all programs wherever they are within the system, even though the context of each program varies greatly. And as we will see, there's a common evaluation form that is applied to all programs in all areas, whereby the dimensions of the evaluation and the subdimensions of the evaluation are predetermined. What is flexible are the specific indicators that are used by each knowledge area. As I said, there are 49 knowledge area. And so within this structured form where you have dimensions, subdimensions predefined, you have the various knowledge areas defining the specific indicators that they will be using for the evaluation process. It's primarily an external evaluation, which is something that's been highly criticized over time because in most countries, including the United States, the internal evaluation or within institution evaluation is actually the most fundamental aspect of efforts to improve quality. This exists in Europe, it exists in North America, where the self-evaluation, the internal institutional evaluation is the key element. But in the case of Brazil, the national evaluation that Copies conducts as an external evaluation, it is just now, based on changes made in 2018, beginning to put an emphasis on internal evaluation. And when you're dealing with a purely external evaluation, and you're dealing with a standard evaluation, and you're dealing with a centralized evaluation because everything is conducted out of Brasilia by Copies, you obviously have problems in terms of meeting the specific context and the great variety of contexts that exist in Brazil. As I mentioned, we have a scale that now has 7 levels, and the top 2 levels, 6 and 7, are considered to be very exclusive. As I said, the scale has specific purposes, including one of the purposes is international cooperation. The logic is if you have programs in which you can advertise as being high quality in an international context, which the 6 and 7 is supposed to denote, high quality in an international context, then it's much easier to establish linkages with other programs in other parts of the world, because in other parts of the world, they are aware that indeed Brazil has top level programs. So one of the purposes of the scale and the fact that the top level is exclusive is to promote articulation and collaboration with programs in other parts of the world. And as I've said, it's a high stakes evaluation because it started with the idea of distributing money. And this idea continues until today. Better programs, more money from the federal government. It also has other implications, including whether or not a program has a legal right to exist. Because if you don't obtain a 3 on this 7-point scale, the program is not legally recognized. Please go on. Now, I put forth here the evaluation form. Excuse me, did we miss I'm just wanting to go back because I think we may have missed a slide. Yes, we missed this slide right here. So while we're talking about the Copies evaluation, remember we're talking about the judicialization, and so I'm arguing that we have to understand the evaluation in order to understand the judicialization and the implications of the judicialization. So let me say a little bit more about the nature and the undergirding theory behind the evaluation that Copies conducts. And as I mentioned, it's basically been conducted in the same format since 1980. And first of all, using terminology from the evaluation, we have the summative aspect of the evaluation. We have a specific period. The information is accumulated. It's cumulative information over that period. And at the end of the period, there's an evaluation in which each program receives a grade from 1 to 7. So that's the summative aspect. But there's a formative aspect that we emphasize, but not formative in the sense of the element being evaluated, as the word is often used, but formative in the sense of the evaluation process itself. In other words, the evaluation process is viewed as formative in the sense that it's constantly subjected to reflection and adjustment and change based on the evaluation that was previously conducted. At the end of every evaluation period, there's the evaluation. And based on that evaluation, then new proposals are put forth to improve the evaluation process. So this formative aspect, the constant improvement of the process, is something that's highly emphasized within the context of a summative evaluation. We have, as I mentioned, a cycle. It's now every 4 years. Our last cycle went from 2017 through 2020, and the evaluation for that cycle was supposed to take place in 2021. But because of the judicialization and also the pandemic impact, we're conducting this evaluation now in 2022 in reference to the period of 2017 to 2020. Before that, we had a 4-year period going from 2013 to 2016, and the evaluation was conducted in 2017. In other words, the evaluation is always conducted at the end or after, the year after the end of the evaluation period, which means that the changes that we're talking about that are based on the experience of the evaluation really aren't implemented until the second year of the new evaluation period. This is part of the problem that was raised judicially, and we'll get back to that. I have here the actors, and I think I've already mentioned the four key actors, which are the programs. And as I said, there are almost 5,000 programs. And these include programs with just a master's degree, programs with just a doctoral degree, programs with both master's and doctoral degrees. And it includes both academic programs and professional programs, as we have in the United States, this kind of distinction between what is more theoretical and what is more applied. But the actors include the programs, it include the area coordinators, it includes all of those that participate in these various evaluation commissions and committees, which are academic peers, and it includes this scientific board that has a final word with regard to the approval of the final grades. In other words, the areas recommend a grade, and the scientific council examines whether or not the evaluation was well done and examines whether or not the grade that's being recommended should be approved, or perhaps another grade should be approved, and the final word is with the scientific council. I like to make the differentiation between indicators and criteria, because this is a confusion that is constant in the discussions about evaluation, the difference between an indicator and a criteria. The indicator is indicating what is to be evaluated. The criteria indicates how that indicator is going to be evaluated in terms of what is a positive or a negative result for that indicator. In other words, what discriminates between levels of quality for a given indicator. That is the criteria. But the indicator is what indicates what is going to be evaluated. As I mentioned, the indicators are determined by each area based on this standard form that Copies has developed. When I say Copies has developed, it's been developed with this active participation of all these participants that come from the academic community. It's not developed by a staff, it's developed by members of the academic community. And finally, on this slide, I mentioned the evaluation form, and so based on that, we'll pass on to the next slide, where we will briefly look at the evaluation form. We will see that the evaluation form now has 3 different dimensions. We have a dimension dealing with the program, we have a dimension dealing with student learning and student achievement, and we have a dimension dealing with societal impact. This is a model, kind of a classic model, where we're considering inputs, which are the program. We're considering processes, which is the student learning and achievement process, and we're dealing with results, which is the societal impact. So we're dealing with these 3 components. Each of these components are broken down into sub dimensions. I put some in red here because they're particularly important. They represent new changes. For instance, the fact that the issue of strategic planning and self-evaluation is now an object of the external evaluation. The fact that there's an emphasis on the career trajectories of former students is a new emphasis that is now being given. The fact that the faculty output, which previously was an independent dimension with a lot of weight. In fact, most people thought that the most important thing about the copies evaluation was the faculty output, because it was a specific dimension and it had a lot of weight. But now there's an effort to change that focus, to emphasize the student learning and achievement as the key concern of a graduate program, and to look at the faculty output as part of that process of preparing students to do research and to produce new knowledge, which is really the key concern for graduate programs, whether on the master's or the doctoral, whether professional or academic. It's preparing people to produce new knowledge. And so that is why the student output, the professor output is fundamental, because it's only by participating in knowledge production, participating in research, that students learn how to produce new knowledge. And finally, I have at the bottom here a differentiation that is new that we're making between distinguishing and giving greater emphasis to either internationalization, as a program internationalized, or as a program focusing more on local and regional involvement, engagement. At one time, these two factors were considered independently, but now they're considered in a reciprocal manner, in the sense that a program based on its purpose, based on its mission, can either be evaluated with greater emphasis on internationalization, or it can be evaluated with greater emphasis on local and regional engagement. Please go on. I should mention that before this particular form was approved in 2018, there were 5 dimensions, and the distinction between these dimensions was not very clear, because there was some overlap in terms of the dimensions. So they didn't have that specific relationship between input, process, and output that we have now. And as I've indicated with the red color, we've introduced new elements that are being evaluated that were not evaluated in the past. Well, I'm talking about all these changes, and this was a talk I gave in 2020, but it's the change that has led to the judicialization, which is the focus of my talk. Because change generated uncertainty, and uncertainty generates insecurity. And when you're dealing with grades that have implications for financing and for legitimacy, obviously there's a concern when anything new is introduced, even though, as I've said, the formative aspect of the evaluation, the idea of an evaluation that's evolving and constantly improved, this has been part of the system ever since it was originally put forth. And most of those that participate, most everybody who participates understands that there are new developments that are going to come out after the evaluation process in the context of the next evaluation period, because the process must be improved based on the previous experience, or should be improved. But not everybody had that idea with the changes that were made. One person, that I will not mention by name, put together a 700-page report showing how the changes that I just mentioned were jeopardizing some programs. In other words, programs would suffer because of these changes, and these changes were not pre-announced. In other words, these changes were made during the evaluation period and not before the evaluation period. Why were they made during the evaluation period? Because they're based on the evaluation experience that took place at the end of the previous evaluation period. So our professor puts together a 700-page report showing or arguing that some programs were being jeopardized, about a union of university professors that were impressed by this report. The person who made the report belongs to this union. And so the union brings a case against copies to the court system. And I'll review what their case was in just a minute. But it's interesting to know that they were the primary actor initially, but the court system did not accept their arguments, because the court system argued that the union itself was not directly involved in the graduate level. They didn't have a specific interest in the issue, and so they didn't really have a right to bring a class action suit or a legal action suit against the copies evaluation. But the federal prosecutor's office takes up the same argument. They're impressed by the argument that union is putting forth. And they take it up in the name of the Brazilian public. What is the Federal Prosecutor's Office? The Federal Prosecutor's Office is an independent body created by the Constitution, supposedly independent of the other branches of government, that is responsible for prosecuting irregularities that occur in the federal sphere, irregularities that the federal system of courts is responsible for dealing with, but specifically it focuses most often on irregularities that happen within the Brazilian federal government. And we all know about the huge so-called car wash period in which 300 and some people were indicted for illegal activities within the Brazilian government or associated with the Brazilian government. And the former president of Brazil spent 1.5 years in jail, mainly because of the prosecutor's office taking forth this idea of irregularities, taking to the courts and arguing and convincing the courts that indeed wrongdoing had been conducted. And the prosecutor's office continues in the same vein. It recently came out that they're investigating the present president for his involvement in manipulating the price of oil, which is not legally possible under the Brazilian law. They've investigated quite heavily the sons of the current president for supposed irregularities. They don't always win their cases. In other words, many of the cases are lost within the court system because the judges don't approve of what the prosecutors are arguing. But the prosecutors have this job and they work independently. And this is something I want to emphasize because many people believe this judicialization that's taking place, that's jeopardizing the copies evaluation, is really due to the present government, the Bolsonaro government. Well, Bolsonaro government does not like the academic community. He criticizes it constantly. He especially criticizes the area of human and social sciences because he believes it's fomenting radical thinking. He has greatly reduced, or his government has greatly reduced financing for research and for universities, but they are not responsible for this judicialization that I'm talking about today, because this is brought on by an independent body composed of over 800 professional prosecutors that have devoted the profession to being prosecutors and go through a rigorous process of being selected to participate as a federal prosecutor. So the independence of the Ministry of Education, of the prosecutor's office, is quite well established in the context of Brazil. Please go on. So we come now to, let's move back. I think we went through 2 slides, okay? So what are the arguments? Why are the federal prosecutors attacking the evaluation of copies? Well, they're using terms, and I put one term here in English and the other term in Portuguese. I don't know why, but using the Portuguese, they're using 2 terms, anterioridade and heterotividade. What do these mean legally? And I'm talking about in Brazil. Well, anterioridade means that anybody that is affected by a law or a rule or a policy has the right to know about that law or rule or policy before it is implemented. They have to know of this regulation or law before it actually becomes law or becomes practiced, at least to the extent that there are people that are jeopardized. If nobody's jeopardized, this issue does not really have any impact. But when people are jeopardized because a law has been implemented or a rule has been implemented that affects somebody negatively and people were not aware that this rule would be implemented, then that is a violation of the notion of anterioridade. Or the reciprocal is heterotividade. In other words, laws or rules or regulations or policies cannot be applied retroactively. In other words, we're talking about an evaluation process where changes were made in 2018 where that new form was produced, new dimensions were introduced, new indicators were introduced, but all this took place during the evaluation period, not before the evaluation period. So this was the key element in the judicial process that the prosecutors took to the legal system. Along with that was the argument that the comparative evaluation means that only some programs reach the top. Not all programs can reach the top at any given moment, because the comparative evaluation is an evaluation in which the final result is determined comparatively and not determined based on predetermined criteria. Let me briefly mention this because I was going to talk about it before. The idea is that, as I mentioned, the copies evaluation is formative in terms of its conceptualization, but it's comparative. It uses the comparative approaches that is commonplace when you're working with scale, and you're concerned about the maintenance of the integrity of the scale in terms of its ability to differentiate or separate levels. In this instance, levels of quality. We use this, for example, in university rankings. A university like Stanford knows the indicators that a particular ranking system is going to utilize. They know that they should do as well as they possibly can on those indicators, but they really don't know where they're going to end up in the ranking, because where they end up depends on all the others who are within the ranking context, how the others are going to perform on those particular indicators. And so there's really no way of knowing until the results of a given program or a given institution, in the case of university rankings, there's no way of knowing where you're going to end up in the rankings without knowing the performance levels of the others in those particular indicators that are under consideration. So this is comparative evaluation. It's often referred to as norm reference evaluation. It's often referred in other contexts as competitive evaluation. In other words, it's not a predetermined criteria that's going to determine your result. It is how your result compares with the results of others, and the final evaluation outcome is determined by this comparison between different results for different evaluated elements. This is important because they represent two basic concepts within the world of evaluation. The notion of pre-existing criterion referenced evaluation, and the absence of pre-existing criteria, or in other words, norm reference or comparative evaluation. Okay, I've just given you the arguments against the copies evaluation. Arguments based on the notion of anterioridade, heterogeneidade, the lack of pre-established criteria, the fact that the indicators are created during the evaluation period and not before the evaluation period, and the fact that the evaluation means only a few and not everybody can reach the top of the scale. What are the arguments in favor of copies? Well, copies obviously had to respond to this kind of legal action. It has a legal department that's part of a national legal system, a Solicitor General's type system, in which you have people within every component of the federal system having a body that is responsible for representing judicially that particular body. And so copies has a group of people within it that represents the interests of copies judicially. And so they had to prepare, obviously, arguments. And we, members of the Scientific Council and other participants in the process, produced various documents and various justifications for the evaluation of the copies develops in order to counteract these arguments that were being put forth by the federal prosecutors. So what are the arguments? Well, we argued with respect to the formative evaluation, the idea of improving the evaluation. The argument was that we should apply the evaluation that was developed in the 2013 to 2016 period to the 2017-2020 period. In other words, what was developed before 2017 would be applied now in the evaluation that we're doing now. And what we did now, for instance, that form that was developed in 2018 would only be applied in the evaluation of the next evaluation period, which would be 2025. Well, that means you're not improving on a constant basis, and you have a huge lag time between what you determine and the application of what you determine. And as we know, the scientific world changes very rapidly. So one of our arguments was the idea that copies has to have this ability to make changes based on their previous experience, and they don't have to wait 4, 5, 6, 7 years to implement changes that they recognize as necessary based on a particular experience. Second of all was the idea of the scale. The argument being that in 1998, the system was changed exactly because virtually all the programs were at the top of the scale, and the scale wasn't functioning. If you're going to have a scale and it has a purpose, in this case for decision-making, whether it be student decision-making or governmental decision-making or international relation type decision-making, when you have a scale, it has to differentiate. And if you use a criterion referenced approach, there's no guarantee that it's going to differentiate. You can end up with all the programs on a particular level because it's hard to predetermine criteria that are going to establish a guaranteed differentiation. I and myself in the area of education had this problem a number of years ago when we did pre-establish criteria for education. This was back when I had the same position in 2007, and we ended up with virtually all of our programs evaluated too positively. And we had to go back and reevaluate because we knew that the Scientific Council would not accept all programs in the area of education, which is already an area that's somewhat questioned by other scientific areas as a true scientific area. We could not argue before this Scientific Council that all of our programs were of high quality. We had to differentiate. So we had to go back and redo our evaluations because the predetermined approach did not function. So the second argument was you've got to preserve the integrity of the scale, and you do that through the comparative process. Another argument was the whole historical precedent, the fact that we have an evaluation process that's been developed over 40 years. Everybody knows that changes are made. Everyone adapts to the changes that are made within the new evaluation period. And these changes that were made in 2018 and shortly thereafter were widely divulged, discussed. Every program was given orientation with regard to what they meant. There were meetings in Brasilia in which all the programs got together to discuss these changes collectively. So it was not done in the dark. In fact, there was a high level of transparency, and this is something we emphasized in our arguments in favor of copies. The fact that everything is transparent and it's based on historical precedent, and that those that are being evaluated know the process and did not expect that the indicators from the previous period would be applied now. They knew that the indicators were being created during this period would be applied at the end of this evaluation, applied at the period of this cycle's evaluation, which, as I said, which should be in 2021, but it's occurring in 2022 because of the judicialization in large part. Also, we talked about the large involvement of academics in the process, the notion of peers, and we talked about the fact that the evaluation process has a huge amount of support. And this support was evidenced by a tremendous amount of manifestations, letters, group declarations in favor of the copy system. In other words, the whole academic community, I think virtually every major academic society produced a document arguing in favor of maintaining the copies evaluation with, yes, the notion of improvements, but not with the notion of undermining or undoing what has been created over a 40-year period. So we emphasized this large support that the academic community was giving us. We emphasized that all of these changes have been widely discussed and divulged in a transparent manner. And we indicated that the constant improvement of copies was important, and the maintenance of the scale, which could only be maintained through a comparative process, that too was important. Go on to the next. But anyway, with all these arguments, copies arguments, and the public prosecutor's arguments, we call it the public ministry in Brazil, but I'm calling it here the federal prosecutor's office. With these arguments, it all goes to a judge in Rio de Janeiro, and the judge wants time to evaluate all this massive amount of information or arguments and so on and so forth. So the judge declares that the evaluation must stop. and it was declared that it must stop, totally stop on the 22nd of September. We were already deeply involved in the evaluation of the previous evaluation period that ended in 2020. And we were already working with committees and commissions, evaluating different aspects that had to be evaluated, but everything had to stop. Even our access to the information, our access to the copies site where the information is available, all of this was denied and everything had to stop. All the committees had to stop working, everybody had to stop, while the judge wanted to review the arguments. Well, this stoppage, of course, creates a huge problem for a process that is really under the gun, so to speak, because we're already in a new evaluation period and we're still evaluating the evaluation period that ended in 2020. So copies takes the issue to upper levels of the judicial system, the appellate level. And finally, after 2 months on the appellate level, it's determined that the evaluation can continue. It can continue, but the right to divulge the findings, the results, the grades, that right is not given. In other words, that decision of whether or not the grades can be divulged is a decision to be made in the future. And meanwhile, the judge, the original judge, is still evaluating whether or not the system should be based on pre-existing criteria. And if it's based on pre-existing criteria, the argument that at least the the public prosecutors are putting forth is that everything should be done according to the 2013-2016 period, because it's that period that established criteria that people know about, supposedly know about, before the current evaluation began. Go on, please. So we have the process that has been stopped for 2 months. It's restarted it's restarted in early December. I put late November on my slide, but I rechecked the date. It was early December that it was restarted. Obviously, it couldn't restart right away because Christmas was coming and vacation period was coming and so on and so forth. So the whole evaluation period that was supposed to end in April of 2022, the whole process will end in December of 2022. And we're now in the evaluation process that we were supposed to do in 2021. But what can happen? What is the future? Well, the future is the judge can still decide that we go back and use the criteria, the indicators, the evaluation form that was used in the 2013-2016 period. Or the judge can decide that, yes, we can go on with the evaluation as it's currently being developed, but the next period has to be based on what is done this period, because in the next period, everybody will know what the criteria, the indicators, the evaluation form is based on this period. And so there'll be no problem of anterioridade, no heterogeneidade. Or the third possibility, which we're working for, which we're trying to, and we're hoping will be the decision, is the judge will allow this process to go forward. We'll be able to divulge the results. We can't believe that we're going to complete this evaluation without the results being divulged. I mean, it doesn't make sense. A lot of public money is being utilized in this evaluation. The evaluation without divulging results goes against the whole notion of transparency, which is an essential legal element of evaluation. So we assume that if we complete this evaluation, the results will be divulged. The question is what will happen in the next evaluation period. Will we be able to improve the evaluation? Will we have to keep everything exactly the same? Or worse still, will we have to do our evaluation for this moment now, go back and redo it based on how it was done in the previous period, which would be a tremendous loss, because all of our changes would not be implemented. The emphasis on self-evaluation, planning, other advances would not be allowed to enter now. They would have to enter when the evaluation occurs in 2025. And it would mean that all the decisions, for instance, our decision in the area of education to eliminate a lot of indicators, these indicators that we eliminated based on the experience of the last evaluation would come back to exist, and nobody has been working in terms of these indicators that we announced were no longer indicators. Also, the data that was collected in the form of the new evaluation form, not informed by the previous evaluation form. But let's go on to the last slide. But what does all this mean? We don't know the outcome. As we're hoping that the outcome will be that the process will continue, we'll complete this evaluation, and we'll be able to make the necessary improvements based on this experience in the next evaluation period. But it does mean that more ambitious efforts that are under consideration. We've talked a lot about a whole new model of evaluation, what we refer to as a multidimensional model that I referred to in my previous talk, a multidimensional model that's based on an experience in Europe. The idea of implementing a new model becomes less and less likely because we do want to make changes, but if we make changes based on this current situation, the changes would have to be minor changes. They couldn't be major because this would renew the whole judicial process. But we're concerned. We're concerned, first of all, that this is going to open the door to excessive judicialization, not just of copies, but of all evaluation, because almost all large-scale evaluations, including those in the United States, are based on the comparative approach. When you take your SAT or you're taking your college records examination, all that's norm-based. It's not based on predetermined criteria. Most all large-scale evaluations in all parts of the world, especially if they're dealing with ranking, use a norm approach or a comparative approach rather than predetermining the criteria. So if criteria has to be predetermined, all of the evaluations, including those that are done by INEPI, and you're going to have a talk by INEPI in a couple of weeks, I think in 3 weeks, Maria Elena will be talking about INEPI. INEPI evaluates basic education and higher education, and it uses norm-based processes to do that evaluation. And so all of that can be undermined. All of an experience of large-scale evaluation to try to guarantee quality of education at all levels in Brazil, which is a big problem. Quality is a big problem. Evaluation is one way of dealing with the problem. But if all evaluation is undermined because it's not based on predetermined criteria, but rather on the norm, or rather on comparisons, then this undermines a huge national effort that's been going on for many, many years, and it would be very sad. So we're very concerned about the future of evaluation in Brazil, obviously with a concern, a special concern for copies, but this has implications for all large-scale evaluations that in Brazil occur not only nationally, but occur regionally also, and all this could be undermined if this notion of judicialization based on predetermined criteria takes hold and allows those that are against evaluations, because there are many interests that do not like to be evaluated, they would have an opening to undo all this process and all this progress that has developed over time. Thank you very much. And now you can put the thank you sign up, and I appreciate it.